All right, let's start the recording. All right. Well, welcome everybody to the August 2020 meetup for Lancaster AI. My name is Rich Everts, and I'm the founder of Lancaster AI, and I'm really excited to come back and have another session here this month. And I think everyone knows that last month's session got canceled. And the reason being that there's simply so much going on. I have a startup that I'm working on, and there's a lot of things that I need to take care of there. And so here this month, I was wondering, should I, do it this month? So I decided to pick a topic that I can use that I kind of have a lot of experience in, and in terms of understanding and a lot of the academic aspects of it, and kind of merge it with some of the things that we've been talking about in the AI space recently, and you hear a lot of people talking about. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and get this started here. Let me share my screen. And okay. All right. So we're going to talk about psychedelics, consciousness, and modern AGI, part 1. So I am really excited to talk about this one. And I just wanted to let you know, in case you don't know, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Suji, and I am also the founder of Lancaster AI. You can contact me at richardeverts.com. And of course, all opinions are my own and not representative of my companies, organizations, or any of my clients. Okay, so this is just me out on a limb talking about things. So let's just get right into it. So psychedelics consciousness. Well, where do we start? So there's been a lot of work done over the years. Different people have started it in different areas. I said we'd go back about to the 1950s in the description. So of course, none of this could start really without a description of Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, which was, of course, a massive dystopian success story. Brave New World Revisited, The Doors of Perception, which is where the Doors got their name from, the band. And he started out everything with a discussion about mescaline and LSD. And he was really getting into psychedelics at that point. And he discussed about the mind-altering aspects of it. And he actually was one of the first people to really take a scientific look at it. I mean, there's plenty of other people, but he's one of the first famous kind of pop culture kind of people that really took a look at this. And then, of course, you get into some of the biggies here, in case you're not familiar with the psychedelics. And of course, we have Timothy Leary from Harvard, and started in the 50s doing research, and then kind of got kicked out in the 60s from Harvard, and went in and out of, I think, 39 prisons, 36 prisons for some of his work with LSD and all these other things. And he was really the epicenter of the 1960s movement for, I think it was tune in, tune out, right? That whole 60s movement of psychedelics. And we'll get into more about his story later, but he was really focused on LSD. That was his baby and everything that he really worked on. And then you had Rick Strassman. He's an MD, and he's a little bit more recent, but he's been doing a ton of work and really focusing on DMT. Now, DMT is one of the main ingredients in ayahuasca, which many of you are probably familiar with out there. And this is a purely medical look at that. And then we have Terence McKenna. And Terence McKenna became really popular in the mushrooms. He's actually into fungi and fungus and that entire movement. And he was really into psilocybin and really looking at the effects of psilocybin on consciousness and on the world at large. And I'm giving this introduction because I want to focus on one in particular. I could talk all day about psychedelics. There are so many topics and so many interesting avenues of academic study on it, simply because it's very open and nobody's done the research. As a Schedule I drug, it has been, since the 1960s really, it's been really a challenge to get a lot of good research on what's going on. And of course, these have been in use for millennia. So one of the first studies in modern times that really has looked at the effects of something like psilocybin. In case you don't know, psilocybin is the active ingredient in what are known as magic mushrooms. And magic mushrooms, of course, being a particular kind of plant species. So they're mushrooms, but they're specific kinds of mushrooms, right? So, and there's different levels of psilocybin depending on any number of factors. Well, anyway, so this gentleman and his team over at Johns Hopkins got a license to study psilocybin, and they came out with a number of amazing pieces of work in 2006, 2011, and they just had one come out here in May of 2020, which looks at the academic aspects of psilocybin and measurable, quantifiable, legit results about what's going on. And so I can talk a little bit about them. But the 2006 session was essentially people taking psilocybin in a very controlled environment, having what's known as a guide or somebody with them the whole time, and describing their experiences and going through these things. And they looked at placebos versus people with specific dosages, and they checked the different dosages. And the reason that they got further funding was because what they found is that the rates for people to stop smoking and antidepressant were off the charts. And not only that, but it held up a year later. So people who had these psilocybin trips were able to alter their behavior in such a way that they didn't relapse into these previous addictive behaviors. And so there's further study in 2011, and in 2020, we'll talk about here in a little bit. So this really paved the way for where we are kind of now with this topic, which is we're seriously looking in the United States about decriminalization. So currently you have 3 US cities, Denver, Oakland, and Santa Cruz, who have already looked at decriminalizing this. And then you have over 100 pending US cities looking at decriminalization of it. And decriminalization, if you remember, in the marijuana decriminalization path that started, that was back only in 2012 when that first started until where we are today. So that's 8 short years. And that now you're looking at it's recreational in places like California, Denver, and you're also looking even at states like Pennsylvania who have medical marijuana now. And so it was a few short years. So you're actually looking at the very beginnings of this psilocybin movement here in the United States. So I'm focusing specifically on mushrooms because it's a natural product and it is, I think, better researched to this point because of some of these studies. And so, but there's also a number of scientific looks into this particular plant species. Are mushrooms more than they appear? Okay, well, there's a question about this. So for instance, number one, you have this thing called the panspermia theory, which is they found on particular objects that move through space, they found different kinds of molecules, essentially is what they are. But what they believe they found is that certain kinds of spores could easily survive the distances and the space of, well, the space of interstellar space. So the movement between stars. And so the idea is that Earth may have been seeded however many millions and billions of years ago by these kind of asteroids that landed and then were able to populate the Earth with specific kind of spores and things that initiated these kinds of life. And these are what's known as the panspermia theory. And there's a lot of variations of this that you can look into. But what we do know is that the mushrooms and that particular line they're really the oldest forms of land life in existence. Excuse me. And so they were the first ones to kind of come out of the water, the first life to come out of the water, because they're part of the birth and decay process. And so they really were the first large species to come out. And you can see these are pictures of what people believe. This was 600 million years ago. They actually believe that the first large objects, which these things look like trees, are actually forms of mushrooms, which dotted the landscape. And so mushrooms are obviously one of the oldest forms of land life around. So if you look at life as a sequence of life and death processes, and you look at epochs, then mushrooms have had the most epochs to generate forms of natural selection over time. And it's interesting. A lot of people have different thoughts about this and what that kind of intelligence and information would look like. Okay, but what does that mean for people? Well, one of the things that we finally discovered out there is that there is a part of the brain that's being affected by psilocybin. And what they found is that, well, let's just put it out here. So there's this thing called the colostrum. Most people don't know what the colostrum is. It's fairly new, but Francis Crick, who co-founded DNA, probably one of the most important biological discoveries of the 20th century. And I don't think I'm making an understatement there. He was so enthralled by the colostrum and using it as a seat of consciousness that on his dying day, he was working on editing a paper about it and trying to make it better before it got released. Okay. Well, how this relates, well, because of that investment and obviously the credentials behind that, Griffiths and their team looked at Johns Hopkins, looked in 2020 at this specifically. So they looked at the colostrum and the effects of psilocybin. And what they found is that psilocybin acutely alters the functional connectivity of the colostrum with brain networks that support perception, memory, and attention. Okay. Why does this matter? So the colostrum is kind of like a connective, think of it as a connective superhighway. So many of you know, based upon my prior work that I have out there. I'm not sure if I can mute folks out there. There we go. Okay. No worries. So what we're going to do is look at what you have is, in my previous talks, I've discussed that the cerebral cortex, so we have these different layers of it. And one of the things that we have is that they're all connected. And they all run through this thing called the colostrum. So almost everything in the brain gets wired through this particular one little piece of tissue. And so like all the commands get kind of wired through it. And it's only a recent discovery. People are still kind of unsure about all that it does. But what we do know is that when you put psilocybin into it, it reduces the processing speed. So the amount of information flowing through that superhighway by anywhere from 30 to 50%, which in a lot of cases, well, leads to a lot of the effects that we're going to discuss next. But think of it, the reduction of processing speeds as you go through here. So what does that entail in a subjective analysis? So as a subjective experience of the psilocybin trip, what people end up having is, number one, they have this thing called ego dissolution is what people experience. So there's this idea that who you are kind of melts away and you experience this oneness with the world and existence. And this oneness it's difficult to put into words is often the thing that you will hear. And it's this connection with, whether it be higher beings, higher powers, each other, sometimes Earth, in this the Gaia, and those kind of things. So there's this notion of ego dissolution. The I goes away, if you will. You have this effect of time distortion. And they've shown that individuals on psilocybin have challenges focusing on any event that happened over a 2.5 second period. So a short attention span. But it's almost like attention gets elongated. You recognize more what those thoughts are. And that's been the subjective experience of that time distortion. Now, many of you know that in our talks, and I've had many personal talks with people who attend this, Lancaster AI, over time, that I'm a firm believer that all consciousness is the proper reduction of time-based events. your brain's just a manager of time events is what comes down to. And that's where the consciousness comes from, is being able to create itself in time, right? So this time distortion is kind of a big deal. All right, so here's one that's kind of cute, but there's this idea of machine elves. And I'm not sure how to explain this to those individuals who don't have experience in discussing these topics. So one of the subjective experience is these entities that exist between another dimension and this dimension. And so and usually these machine elves are found on the higher levels of the psilocybin doses. And it's also very common to DMT. So many individuals, it's almost 100% of individuals on DMT ayahuasca report something like this, some kind of interdimensional focus. And the way it's described in the literature is essentially being able to talk. It's like walking into a bar with other beings. So some of them are surprised to see you. Like if you just popped in out of the blue. Some of them are surprised to see you. Some of them you'll have a conversation with. Some of them represent simply a different modality, different thought process. Some of them will help you when you're there. Some of them were not so helpful. And so that's kind of what the machine elves are. And they're not always available. Like they're not always visible. I know that McKenna, for instance, spoke about his particular machine elves that he would run into. He ran into pterodactyls or whatever that were silent and standing as guardians of the gate to this dimension. Okay, I'll let you do whatever you want with that, but this is a very common experience, and it needs to be talked about with subjective experiences. Another thing that they have is this thing called the voice of the shroom. And this is when people discuss shrooming, they'll talk about this notion that the mushroom has a voice, like it kind of speaks through them in a way. And this does kind of raise some interesting questions about whether you look at panspermia or you look at the use of mushrooms as being the oldest land life, if you will. It also, in case you didn't know, is the largest land life. And there is one mushroom out in Oregon that takes up 2,200 acres. And that's massive, in case you don't know. That's, I forget, like 60 blue whales or something like that, like an enormous amount. And it's a single organism. And so that's enormous. And not only that, but it's also the oldest. There are some mushrooms that have been looked to live up to 150,000 years. So there's definitely a different form of life, and whether it's intelligent or not and able to react against its environment in specific kinds of ways, it's a debatable question. So whether it can communicate via other means with different animals like humans, I mean, that's something that is unknown, obviously, and it's kind of out there, if you will, for a lot of people. But when you're talking about subjective experiences, many people swear that the shrooms have a voice of some kind. Okay? So I don't have a ton of time here, so I'm going to focus on time distortion and ideas behind that. Okay? So number one, the potential dissolution of the ego comes from the time dilation. And so when you have a 30 to 50% reduction in the amount of information that's getting processed through the claustrum, or claustrum, depends on who you talk to, I guess. But when you have a 30 to 50% reduction in that, you're looking at what kind of information can get passed through there. Well, not all the information is getting passed. And so obviously you have a breakdown of what is the eye, like the sensory perception. You're unable to continue to map time, as you will, around you in the events and experiences going on. And so, right, so that lowers your ego and your center of identity. And the question is, well, we're going to get to time, more about that in the next topic. So there's another thing that time dilation is interesting for, which is McKenna attractors. So there's this idea that the future is pulling the past towards itself. Why is that interesting? Well, for instance, think of a bowl that has a funnel at the bottom of it. And you take a marble at the top and you release that marble and it starts to spin and spin and spin. Well, the future position of that marble, without a doubt, is this funnel opening, right? But if you span that and you think about it being a piece of time instead of being a physical substance, you can see that the marble dropping in there, the attractor actually would exist in a future time, but its effects are felt backwards through time. And so it's an interesting idea about information being pulled forward through time. This is also something very interesting, and I follow a number of, there's an interesting man named Anton Petrov, which is, he runs What the Math on YouTube, which is a fascinating series. Every day he has new and interesting things that happen in space and physics. But one of the things that he discusses is that in our local cluster of galaxies, and so you look at, there's thousands of galaxies in these local clusters, and they're kind of moving through space, but they're moving in a particular kind of direction, but they're moving towards something. There's an attractor that's pulling the galaxies towards it, but to this day, we've been unable to find what that attractor is and identify it. And so it's an outstanding problem of astronomy that they're working on, but there has been discussions of McKenna attractors being part of that study and in that work. So interesting topic. We're going to come back to that one as well. Okay, so this one's a little bit of a gobbledygook, and I apologize for that, but the idea is scaling of time, where epigenetic changes transition information to language and accelerating network impacts. So it turns out that a lot of McKenna, who is kind of like the godfather of the psilocybin movement, a lot of his work focused on something called the singularity, which, if you remember, Ray Kurzweil, probably know him from, he's been at Google now, talks a lot about the singularity. And this is idea that technology is accelerating change, and at approximately 2050, that accelerated change will actually outpace itself and hit infinity. And they think that this is the moment that technology will actually cross this AGI threshold and start creating itself. And at that point, within a second of that point, it will create technology millions of times faster than humans could possibly comprehend. So technology kind of takes off on its own and leaves humanity behind, because we can no longer understand and comprehend the universe that intelligence builds. And that's a singularity. And it's not an uncommon theory. Like, singularity is mainstream in the tech community now, and it's pretty impressive what they're looking at. So this idea of scaling of time, so epigenetic just means changes in the genes over time. There's this idea that almost, and this is a funny way of putting it, that plants made people or animals to carry them around. So we're actually created by the effects of previous plants and stuff to actually help them move around. So we serve an actual evolutionary purpose for plants. And there's some other topics in here which are very interesting that people look at. Things like the fact that the trees, perhaps in order to exist further, needed to pull the carbon which was trapped in the earth out of the earth and put it into the air, because essentially they were facing extinction during the ice ages. And so this scenario was created where they, with some sense of purpose, whatever that means, generated the human consciousness, if you will, and allowed that to grow so that we would eventually dig out the fossil fuels and put them into the air for the plants. And that over time, what's happening is that, knowing that this would lead to our extinction, and continue to keep the plants moving forward. And I don't know about that. I'm just putting theories out there so you know what people are talking about in this particular area. Okay, so that's kind of what this is. All right, so let's break this down a little bit further and what this means for AI, right? So we've been talking about psychedelics for a lot. So I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to that idea and kind of what people are talking about and what some of the trips are, et cetera, et cetera. But where does it relate to AI? Okay, well, multi-temporal information exchange. So this found its way into what's known as ResNet. So many of you are familiar with this neural network. So we have a weight layer, 2 weight layers. We have ReLU activation layer at the before and after. But we take the information that's previously here in X and we wrap it around into the ReLU here. So that into the ReLU function. So that and the purpose of this was because when you get neural networks that have hidden networks that are too long, so ResNet's what, 34, 50, and whatever the other numbers are, so that's the number of layers that you have in ResNet. What you lose sometimes when you're doing back propagation is you're going to lose information, right? And you're not going to, what happens back here earlier in the network may have an actual huge impact on what the result is, but because you run the back prop here, most of the actual work of the back prop gets lost in here. And so by the time it gets to the end, there's almost no symbolic information that it can attenuate itself to here at the beginning, right? I mean, that there's just, so it'll never really, even if it has a huge effect at the beginning weights, it'll never actually appear and the model will not converge properly, okay? And so this idea of multi-temporal information exchange did find its way into here. So what we have here is, if you think of a ResNet, so ResNet 34 as all these layers, well, if you understand how a computer works, essentially these layers is a kind of a timeline, if you will. And that timeline is getting represented semantically in RAM when it gets stored in there. And so like you have, 20 layers up here, 20 layers behind here. And so when you run this computation, you run inference. So you run this ability to say, okay, this particular model, for instance, inferencing on a object detection model, you feed it the image, and then it goes through and it multiplies it by the specific weight layers, layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, and we're just doing matrix multiplication, right, as we go through until we get a result at the end. So it's really just a bunch of heavy multiplication is what these are, heavy statistical analysis. And so that's stored, but that is a timeline of events that have to happen. They happen really fast in a computer because you have billions of cycles per second. But nonetheless, it is still a shape of time. And so this is a way of connecting 2 pieces of time together and trying to keep that information stored. Okay, so this idea did find its way into here, which is interesting. So, but are there other ways that this could be expanded a little bit? And the answer is yes, of course. But here are just some ideas, and I'm really just throwing ideas out here that I've had with a couple of other people and we've spoken about. And I don't know if these are for facts, but these have been suggested. So I'm just putting that proviso out there. So number 1, we have quantum networks. If you dealt with any kind of quantum learning, deep learning, you've looked at quantum neural networks, quantum computing, all of these things. The essence of quantum computing is that you have this piece of information, if you will, known as a qubit, which can either be in what's known as an on-off state, essentially. I mean, they're really taking a lot of what's known as von Neumann ideas about state and applying them to the quantum realm. So really what they're trying to do is they're trying to replicate the von Neumann architecture of computers, which we all grew up with, on quantum materials. And so that may or may not be the way forward. We may actually need a new way of thinking about information computation, but that's not what they're doing right now. Okay, so when somebody says quantum computing, they're essentially talking about replicating computers as they exist now. Now, they do have these things called quantum networks, and so they are able to feed information in, and they do really, really well when there are specific tasks focused on heavy computation, which might take 10,000 years for a normal computer to compute. It can compute very quickly. And this is wonderful for things like cryptography, which is why most of the nation states that you find today, including China, Europe, and the United States, have all kind of have their own what's known as what's that process? Black projects, if you will, to try to get to the first countries that could run this. Now, the Chinese have, and I've spoken about this before, the Chinese have successfully created some quantum cryptography and quantum information exchange, which is very interesting, and they are doing very well commercially. So they're probably even further along when it comes to their actual secret programs. Now, these quantum networks manage time, obviously, in a different kind of state, and we're going to actually talk a little bit about later on a specific kind of network. But these different things, when you tie it in with entanglement, so entanglement is this idea that two atoms or two pieces of matter can be tied together at distance, and one can affect the other. So they don't have to be next to each other in a chain. And people have used all kinds of ideas, string theory, which I think is essentially dead in a lot of ways, according to a number of individuals, but everyone's saying it's dead all the time. But there's this idea that there's some kind of multidimensional space curvature that actually connects them. So like, you know, 6-dimensional, 7th-dimensional, 11th-dimensional. I think Eric Weinstein, I think, says there's 14 dimensions. That's some of his recent work on it. But this idea that they're connected via non-4-dimensional space. And so we have these hyperfolds that exist between them. So space has a different curvature as you go into it. And so this is a potential way to manipulate those. And they're actually looking at this and really starting on that. And whether that's actually going to make it into any kind of mass consumer AGI agent, obviously that's not going to happen anytime soon. But it is a particularly interesting area for doing some of the further computations. And I'm kind of laying the groundwork for discussion a couple of slides here later. Now, we also have multi-state 4D recurrent networks. And the reason I discuss these is because this is something that potentially could happen. And so everyone knows when you deal with neural networks, and this is very simple. Obviously, you can have tons and tons of layers. I think, you know, YOLO has 104 layers, something like that. And within each model that you have for a neural network, often you'll have connections between previous data that'll pull it forward, right, in the model, in that temporal space. And we discussed why that is, right, because backprop and losing information. I think in YOLO, they actually have two significant ones that pull it back from the very beginning, kind of in the middle, before they have these branches, and it pulls it forward and kind of pulls it all together, so you don't lose as much information. But that's in a single pass from a model. The question is, how do you have information that holds over time? And so this is something that I was simply looking at and kind of thinking about a different kind of temporal. So instead of being multi-temporal, this is almost like a trans-temporal, if you will. So if this is 5 models which happen in a recurrent neural network, normally what happens is in a recurrent network like an LSTM or something like that, you have an output layer which feeds to an input layer. And that output layer will feed into the next input layer. And then you have that happen over a certain amount of frames, 10, 15 frames, and that's how it maintains memory over time. But what if instead of connecting the output nodes, we're actually connecting individual hidden nodes to each other in there and allowing those to be trained? So it's almost like in Star Trek 2. And I'm sorry for the reference to Star Trek. I know some of you aren't Trekkies, and that's okay. But a lot of people in the audience will understand this reference, which is one of the things that in the final battle between Kirk and Khan was that Khan, who was this super intelligent individual, was pursuing what's known as a 2-dimensional attack vector. And Spock pointed this out to Kirk, and Kirk was able to use 3-dimensional space to basically lower himself below another ship and then come around using three-dimensional space. And this is one of the cool things, if you ever had the opportunity to play 3D chess, is differentiates it from 2D chess, is that there's multiple layers of complexity to it that you can attack, and it opens up also other ideas. And so it's almost if you could stack these, you could create connections between the different layers in specific ways that would allow information to be fully passed in without having to pull the previous entire information in there. So it's just an interesting way of looking at it and moving forward and how that could all affect different ideas. So these are just some of the ideas that if you brought a multi-temporal view to it, you would look at networks a little bit differently. Okay, so let's keep moving here. So we also have something like McKenna attractors and GANs. So one of the things, and I've spoken about GANs before, these are what's known as generative adversarial networks. And the difference between GANs and other kinds of neural networks is that essentially you have two agents that are training against each other, with one trying to fool the other. So you have a generator who tries to generate a particular kind of item, and a discriminator who says, yes, that is what I'm looking for, that's real, or boom, hey, that's obviously fake, that crap that you're building, you know, send it back, right? And this is an example of using the number MNIST, but people use it obviously for deep fakes, right? So you take, we did a talk on deep fakes a while ago. And so you essentially take all these pictures of what you want an image to look like. So in our example, we used Commander Riker, and because he had a beard and it matches my beard. So they have to look somewhat similar. And then you run it through this process of training it until the computer creates these vectors to know how to translate that face, and you apply it to an actual video, and it'll cut out the faces and then use that matrix to build it upon their face. And that's how general adversarial networks work. And it's interesting because in general adversarial networks, they're notoriously hard to train because they have two agents running together. And so you kind of have to, this is, if you don't know, this is the Nash equilibrium. So this is this idea of where two particular shapes join each other. You got to find that minima point of two particular shapes. And so you get this complex geometry that you have to traverse in order to find. And so that complex geometry is really difficult to find a local minima on, right? And of course, we know that's what we're doing in a neural network. We have this data, and we're trying to find the minima, or to minimize the loss, right, of what we're doing. And that's all neural networks really are, is minimizing this loss. Whereas GANs are minimizing loss on special geometry, which made it very different. And so what we have here is traditional networks map a typology of information in a single closed system, right? So you have that single point, you know what it is, boom, let's get there. GANs represent a mapping topology of a present and future system. So there's two particular kinds of systems here. And so you have the future image and the current image, and they're actually competing in the space in a unique kind of way. Now, of course, you do have a future and past when you're training other standard neural networks, because you have, you know, the end object that you want, and you want to be able to, you know, you backprop that through the network. But it's different where you have a GAN which has a specific kind of latent space, which has this, it's a special way of holding the information as it gets processed. So it's a different kind of topology. And it's almost like you're trading this future and present states in this equilibrium, which is an interesting way of looking at it. And it does make for an interesting look. It's what's known as quantum GAN supremacy. So quantum GAN supremacy is this idea that you can replicate quantum materials in a convincing way. So in case you don't know, one of the ways that quantum cryptography works so well and easily is that you always know when a message has been read, right? Because it alters the state. Okay, so when you observe something, it changes the state, and the basics quantum mechanics there. And so that's why it works so well in cryptography, because you always know if a message has been listened to or not. But with quantum GAN supremacy, basically you can establish that we can actually take that piece of information, possibly replicate it and forward it on as if it's a real piece. And so this is an actual utilization of generative adversarial networks using this future and past kind of attractor methodology to create a usable and productive neural network. And they are doing pretty well with these. These came out in 2018, and that's when the papers were written, and there's been a lot more work done on this. And if you're really interested in quantum computing and its uses, I would highly recommend checking out the idea of quantum GAN supremacy if you haven't already heard of it. Now, all right, so here I'm going to take a little walk on the wild side and just throw out, if it hasn't been wild for you already, I'm really going to take a look at something which I don't think you're going to hear anywhere else. So that is this idea of quantum coherence and kind of neural activity. And this is going to tie in directly with a slide 2 slides from now, but we'll talk about a little bit there. But so Yang-Mills is this idea. So Yang-Mills is a quantum theory, and it's open for like one of those Millennium Prizes. Like, you know, if you solve these 8 problems, you get $1 million, or one of these 8 problems, you get a bunch of money and stuff like that. So it's like a prize for mathematics. So what Yang-Mills is trying to create is this idea of, I think it's called a matter map. I can't remember off the top of my head, and I apologize. But they're trying to create essentially the first level of energy. And they're trying to find, the Yang-Mills is a way to describe 5 to 6 dimensional space at levels far below the size of an atomic nuclei. So this is almost like at the foam level, like the very lowest level of energy, to understand those 5 and 6 dimensional quantum fields. And they're trying to, you know, how does that low level of energy, which is a mathematical construct, how do you get from there to the first lowest level of energy, a minimum level of energy? It's also what's known as I like to think of it as a Markov blanket, and some of you who've done machine learning know what Markov trees are. But Markov is, think of it as like blankets that get wrapped around things and they encapsulate something. And so a Markov blanket, a great idea is like those little Russian dolls that you have, right, that have the little sizes as they get smaller and smaller and smaller. Each of those is a Markov blanket, which can live inside of one another, right? So that's what a Markov is. It's a designation that makes something what it is, right? So, so this idea of, you know, can we create a Markov blanket around that first piece of energy and these Yang-Mills? Now, when you get into these quantum theory ideas, one of the things that you run into is everything is based on time, and where t is the dependent variable. Well, we want to make it an independent variable. We actually want to have t be just like any other variable in this process. I think I got those right. Maybe I don't have those right. But you want t to be solvable just like any of the other ones. And the only way that you can do that in quantum theory, I believe, is to be able to use these kind of theories in a quantum gauge, and I'm going to butcher the name, but it's quantum gauge field or theory, I think that's what it's specifically called. It's been a while, but it's this idea that we can isolate time. Okay, why does that matter? Okay, what does all that have to do with what we're talking about here? Well, many of you know I've spoken many times about microtubules, which is the idea from Sir Richard Penrose that there's these, and they exist in our neural pathways, and they exist all over the body, but you see them, these run all throughout. This is a nerve here. This is an axon, right? These are dendrites, and you have all this information getting passed through here. And there's this idea that microtubules are the seat of consciousness, and because it can manage quantum effects in the brain, and there's been some hotly debated questions about that. Okay, not saying that it's true yet or not. What I'm saying is that there is definitely some evidence for this. And so, for instance, when you look at a microtubule, one of the things that you'll see is that it has extremely high levels of symmetry. And that extreme level of symmetry is exactly what you need for quantum coherence as information travels. And so while it does seem that electricity and electromagnetic forces are carried through the exon, they're actually, or the axon, there may be some actual quantum effects that are different as we move forward through here. And so what that may mean is that the way you experience consciousness is specifically tied into a quantum field, which is a unique way of handling time. And it's not necessarily, you may be feeling the effects of it, but not the actual experience of it, if that makes any sense. So these are just some, we're talking about attractors. There may be things pulling you forward at this level through time. So for instance, I like to use the example of sometimes you react to something before you're consciously aware of it. There's a lot of reasons for that, but think about a decision you've ever made. You've sat there and thought about it, but in many ways, we as individuals, really, we make decisions all the time, and then we find reasons to justify those decisions. That's often what rationalization is that we've already made the decision. We're just trying to find reasons to justify that. And it's a key tool used by individuals who are either people who want to take advantage of it, normally in things like politics or religion, or anybody who's trying to convince you of a particular topic will use these. You've already made the decision, but they give you beliefs or particular ideas to hold up those legs, to hold up the idea. And so it's almost like you're using the future's pulling you forward, and you're just kind of a being along the ride, so to speak. And what does that mean for free will and other ideas? Whole another topic. Okay. I'm still focused on the AI aspects of this consciousness, trying to wrap it all together. There is this idea of scaling of time. Okay. This is from what's it called? Lord of the Rings, right? Obviously, these are the Ents from Lord of the Rings. And I think probably most people have seen this and probably at some point. I don't know if they suffered through the extended editions or not, but most people have seen these. So what we have here is the idea is that the Ents have been around for a long time, but they experience time at a different level. And this is clearly one of the things that people are starting to come out with this idea that plants have consciousness, which is admittedly fascinating to me because of the implications, of course. But what we have is that they experience existence on a very different time scale. And they process on a different time scale, just like the Ents did in Lord of the Rings. Remember, they had their language is very long. It took them all day just to say hello, right? Because they experienced that. And similarly to the way we look at things. So for instance, because we live about 100 years, give or take, maybe a lot of us alive today will be 150. We're working on it. But a fly that may only have a life of 7 days, or your pet animals can go from anywhere from 10 to 20 years, depending on the animal, right? So you have a different idea of time, and what that experience is can really affect cognition and thoughts. And this is another example of what that means. And this is a logarithmic scale for the singularity. And by logarithmic, what I mean is that in case you don't know math, and that's okay, what this chart is showing you is that you have this exponential, a consistent exponential, right? So an exponential is like it goes like this on a graph, right? And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, faster and faster. Well, log is just kind of the inverse of that. That's all you're doing. You're just coming down and down and down, but you're still doing it exponentially, just a reduction, okay? And so this is 10 million, a million, 100,000, et cetera. So this is a consistent. And this is looking at big events for what are known as epigenetic events. So these are things where massive changes in how a group of pieces of life function. So, this is multicellular organisms to primates, the first early cities, which was a massive endeavor. Print which is actually a rather recent invention, and it seems if Elon Musk is successful, may go away. Interesting topic for another time. And then, of course, computers and personal computers. But what's happening is that notice that all these effects, they're happening faster and faster, and that's the idea of this singularity and things moving forward. So what does that mean for things like these epigenetic changes? So what does that mean? So I spoke earlier about, maybe in a funny way, plants made humans so that, we get the carbon out of the ground and get it up in the air because they love it. That's what they want, right? Is that carbon. Maybe we could do without the mercury, right? But they could definitely use the carbon. Or, things like ridiculous ideas like plants making humans to carry them around, et cetera, et cetera. But there is this idea, which seems fundamental to much of our thought, which is that on every dimension, there is this imprint of the hyperdimensional force that made it. And that's a fascinating idea. It's like if you look at a desert over time, these sand dunes, you can actually go back and it carries the effect of the wind, right, that kind of made it. And you can actually quantify that and you can extrapolate that, right? So that could be designed into mathematical language. Now, this hyperdimensional force, often we as humans can ascribe to, we can ascribe it to gods, monotheistic religions, polytheistic force, things like the Tao, all kinds of ideas about what that force may be. And of course, the materialists will try to reduce it to mathematical equations and things like that. So what we have here, though, is that it seems that there's this transition. Information processing is becoming faster and faster on Earth. And so it took a long time for the information necessary to go from multicellular organisms to humans. It took a long time. But if you look at language, it seems that language became an accelerant, like something that you would throw in a fire to make it burn faster. And so language became this kind of accelerant to matter and to the environment. And we've really picked up a lot on that in these AI platforms. And so we've tried to break these down into specific areas, right? So if you looked at NLP, classical NLP versus deep learning, all it is similar things. Like we're taking these what are known as embeddings. Sometimes we do tokenization. Basically, we're taking symbols. So we believe these words represent symbols of something. And then in a network, we just connect them to a bunch of layers, and we run them through functional parameterization and all that other stuff. Exciting till we get to an output, and then we call it different kinds of sentiment, classification, entity extraction, translations, blah blah blah. It's interesting that we've been able to do this in an artificial way, but one of the things that we're finding is that yes, we could create a convincing bot. In fact, OpenAI, if you remember correctly, created this really great NLP platform, but they didn't release it to the public for a while because, we're so afraid of what it can do and it can be used for bad and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, it probably can, but I don't think anybody in the right mind thinks that that's AGI. Like that system can only respond to text, right? So if you were to go up to it, unplug it, it probably couldn't say much, right? Like it doesn't have an understanding of existential existence. Like it could discuss existential existence, but it cannot react against existentialism. And so there's really no understanding or comprehension of what it's actually implying or what it's processing. It's still a tool acting as a tool. And so what does that mean? Well, they're looking at language the wrong way. And maybe, I'm not saying that it's not helpful and not productive, and it does make mass consumer products work wonderfully. And when it's tied into other systems, works great. But is it AGI? No. Okay, so let's look at this. So for instance, language as a reality builder. So there's this first thing, which is the I Ching and the Tao, right? So many of you have seen this. This is the 64 characters of the I Ching. And in case you don't know, Taoism is a number of sayings and this idea and a way of looking at the world. And it's this idea that you really can't describe the Tao, right? You can't describe it because to put it into language is to already not be it, right? And so there's these ideas. It's, by the way, it's a base 16 system, which I found completely fascinating because it's really easy to count, which is hexadecimal, actually. And if you didn't know, hexadecimal is how we create the colors, the color systems on a lot of internet-based things. So, you know, you have your little pound sign and then a 6-digit item. That's called hexadecimal. And the reason is base 16 really worked in China is because in case you have on your hand, you have 1, 2, 3 of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So that's 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, right? So you can easily use your thumb as an iterator, move through these levels, and then use your numbers to add them, which is, I thought, fascinating. But the idea anyway is that language is a reality builder. And this idea that reality is actually constructed by by the use of language, but it can never be fully experienced with language. And it's an interesting idea. The Chinese and the Eastern thinkers were really separate from the West and how we looked at it. See, in the West, we've been really focused, heavily focused on energy. And a lot of people talk about this in different communities. We've been focused on energy, so much so that we've actually created, well, they've been turned into weapons, but we've been able to create the inner workings of a star on our own planet. And we've been able to harness that energy. And that's what the West has been able to accomplish. Whereas the East is focused not so much on that. They've been focused more on time, right? So this idea of how do we experience and handle time, and language obviously being a tool of time. It's unique how they've worked through this. So language is a way to create reality. All right. Well, what other ideas are there out there that people are using to kind of talk about this? Well, we have what's known as the cognitive theoretic model of the universe. Many of you know Christopher Langan. He's made popular by Malcolm Gladwell. He's essentially has the highest IQ in America. His IQ is somewhere off the charts at 200. Though, of course, once you get to those levels of intelligence, the charts really don't work. Like, actually, once you get past about 150 on the IQ scale, it's very difficult to place you in there. And so they have to do special kinds of testing over those levels. But the idea of the cognitive theoretic model of the universe is that, sorry, I'm going to go back to Christopher Langan 1 second. Because one of the things I love about Christopher is that he did not have a lot of money growing up. And so what happened to him was that he ended up working up as a bouncer at a Long Island bar. And just think about this. The individual with the highest IQ in America working as a bouncer. And then he left and went and worked on his own stuff on his own time. And then he raises horses now out in Kansas, I think it is. But think about what that says about education, or our education system, and how we handle individuals who have aptitude but do not have the financial ability to do specific things. And what we lost as a society with that. So it's just a fascinating topic for me that I talk about in my book and stuff. But so back to the cognitive theoretic model of the universe, it's this idea that reality is a language that is talking to itself about itself. And so we create the universe through our language, but it's a self-referential system that actually is logically sound. and is able to reproduce existence using this kind of closed system. It's quite interesting, and it's very difficult to get through. And I'm not claiming to be an expert on this or any of the topics that I'm talking about, not a huge expert, but I definitely will refer you to check more about this if you're looking at language as a reality builder. Okay, and of course, Christianity being one that most people here will understand. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. This is obviously the big one for the West that we've had going back many, many years. Okay, but one of the things that I want to look at it as is language as an instruction set. I find that to be a little bit more understandable. And so if you think of it this way, as English, and I always mispronounce this word, I think it's phonemes, but we'll see. I'm sure somebody will correct me out there eventually. They're the source code bound by a temporal clock. And so these things, for instance, when you say, I am awesome, right? Because we know we say that to ourselves all the time, every day. We also have embeddings, all right? So this is what we're doing in the neural networks. We're setting up A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, et cetera, et cetera. And then we run statistical analysis on those as if language has a statistical referent. Or we used symbolic, if I equals awesome, right? So symbolic logic and symbolic tools was originally how AI started back in the 50s up at Dartmouth, right? A lot of symbolic ideas, and could we do it through there? So it's almost like the English, those utterances are like the source code. And then what ends up happening is that you run it through a compiler. And so in a way, critical theory, which is very popular, is a way to sort out language, and you look how language is used. Now, the thing about critical theory is they look at power structures, and this whole idea behind it about how language is used as a weapon of oppression, right? It's the famous thing that's swept academia here in the West over the last probably 30 years. But it's really just a compiler. Similar to rational enlightenment, material reductionism, any of these kind of paradigms, mental paradigms that we maintain to kind of control our reality and time, how we exist in time. That's what these are, these compilers. And then as we move forward, then when actual language is the instruction set that we get here. So, for instance, what you run into is, if you're not familiar with instruction sets, these are things in a computer that might take machine language. So this is like MIPS 32, add immediate instruction. So it takes this binary value and it puts them through the specific gates. This is the mnemonic, if you will, for the machine language, add I, R1, R2. So if you're not familiar with the inner workings of how a computer works, you have a high-level language, which we code in, right? These are things like Python, JavaScript, heck, C, C++, Rust, all these languages. These are the things we compile in, or we write our source code in, and then we stick it through a compiler. Now, it's either done at runtime, which means it runs at the time we type it, and that's languages like JavaScript and Python, which you don't have to worry about compiling. But there's compilable languages like C, C++, F#, I think, Rust, all these. You actually have to run it through a compiler to actually spit it out into this machine code. And what that does is, because each of the CPUs, whether it's that are running, so most of you have what are known as Intel 64s, X64, which is the Intel chips. They have specific instructions. Like they have all these instructions in them, which are directions that you can utilize. You can say, call this, call that, call this, call that, all those things. And those are instructions. And that exists on the Intel CPUs, or you have like ARM, which are ARM64, which are very popular in things like the Jetson Nanos, Raspberry Pis, even Apple. Apple's moving to ARM64, right? And your iPads and all those things and your iPhones, those are all ARM64. So they have their own separate instruction set. And so language is almost a kind of instruction set, a way of interacting with reality, the final kind of level. Whereas the words that we speak and the paradigms that we believe are simply the high level functioning of those instructions, just the way that we communicate through there. Anyway, so language is an instruction set. So how could we possibly move forward here? Well, a couple of things. One, we could have a language connected to motor activations using HTM style networks. So if you don't know, Jeff Hawkins, the guy who founded, I think he founded Palm Pilot, if I remember correctly, and sold it for ungodly sums of money. But it might have been some other company, I'm not sure. And he took his money and he became an independent researcher, and he really invested a ton of work and effort into the HTM method. And if you're really interested in biology and consciousness and neural, it's not all great, but it's fascinating, and they really look hard at the math. They look hard at the actual biology, and it is a great place to go check out. I can't recommend them enough. And definitely, and they have all their stuff is free online. Their recent social media manager, I think his name was Matt Taylor, passed away, which is a big blow to them. He was a great guy, but I think they're still posting all the stuff, and you can go check it out. But there's this idea that in your cerebral cortex you have these 7 layers of, I think it's 7 of just 7 layers of tissue that are connected to outside of that thin layer that wraps around your brain, right? And they're connected down in here. And what ends up happening is that there's this voting mechanism, if you will, that happens. And certain regions of your brain are in charge of voting for particular things almost. And whatever it gets the most feedback on, it says, oh, this is what I believe is true. And then that's kind of how it gets passed around. I think that it's a butchering of it, and I apologize to them. But it does make for interesting notions that sometimes that system is bypassed. So for instance, with motor function, right? I forget what it's called, where the doctors tap you on the knee and you have that motor reflex. So certain motor reflexes happen straight from reaction. They're not actually plugged into any kind of conscious thought. And likewise, they've shown a number of studies, I believe, where people had this thing called blind sight, where they may be actually unable to see, but they can react to things in front of them because the stimuli is still being represented and still being processed in a way in particular areas, but not fully. And so if we could look at a way to create a unique instruction set for embodied agents, we may be able to find out some interesting ways of using these kind of theories. And I should tell you what an embodied agent is, in case anybody's wondering out there. An embodied agent is an agent that has sensory apparatus to work in the universe. There's this big question in consciousness whether you need to have a body or not to be conscious. I'm one of those people that believes firmly, yes, you have to have some kind of perception to have consciousness where we are now, right? Because you need to process time. And so you have to have a body to process time. And so it doesn't have to be that way long term. I have some ideas about that. And in fact, if you ever seen 2001 Space Odyssey, the very end of that, this idea that we become pure energy beings is not without merit, but it doesn't actually relate to the AI that we're working on now with AGI and these kind of embodied agents. Okay, well, maybe we could create this undeveloped instruction set for handling massively parallel information. So your brain operates, in case you don't know, I keep saying that word, I'm sorry. Your brain operates at different time speeds, right? So what visual stimuli may be coming in around 20 milliseconds and being processed, auditory could be coming in at 15 milliseconds. Sensory, your fingers could be coming in at 18 milliseconds. And then that's not all also, I don't think it's computation, but the movement of information as it's being transferred around is also happening at different speeds. And so you're getting this this kind of system out of whack, but it's running in parallel. And so it needs to have like a specific kind of instruction set to handle that. And neuromorphic chips, which are becoming much more common these days, are getting there. So what we're doing is, in order to meet Moore's law, which is basically the number of transistors on a chip can double every 18 months, we're actually finding to maintain that computer speed because of the heat that it generates, that we're actually having to go, instead of going stacking transistors on top, boom, 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 we're putting them in parallel. So we're going out now, right? So we're looking at, can we put 18 cores, 32 cores, 64, right? On and on and on. And so, you know, something that we might be able to do is create this specialized instruction set that handles this kind of language ideas, right? And we might be able to do that through there. Yep. Okay, I'm almost done here. So then we also have, I do want to go back to this language connected to a motor activation, because what I'm trying to get the point to is that if we were to replicate a human being, like a human entity, okay, I'm going to use sex bots as an example, and I apologize to those who are sensitive to that kind of stuff, but it's really the first real attempt to build replicants from Blade Runner, and they are actually a very interesting technological achievement for what we're looking at. But they right now, they do not have the capabilities. They have advanced AI, but they don't have the specific kind of movements. The motor neurons aren't tied in specifically, and there's some challenges that they're having with them. And it may be because they're using a von Neumann architecture to control the intelligence of that. Maybe they need an actual special custom chips to process the massively parallel information that's coming in. Okay. Anyway, and then lastly here, transition to biocomputing. And there's this idea that your DNA maintains information, and it does. Your DNA does change over your lifetime. So there are changes that happen. So it seems like between your birth and your death, if you live long enough, there are some transitions that it holds information from your life experience, which if it gets passed on to progeny, is basically an epoch of information, which it can then get, you know, tested out into the universe in a form of backpropagation. So there is this idea of biocomputing, but you can make calculations, but we don't really know how to map information in the bio world as well, because it's so complex. And half the time we don't even understand what's going on. I mean, think about anesthesiology. I'm going to use that as an example because anesthesiologists can cut off consciousness. We know it works. Boom, we turn you off, right? But we have no idea how it works. It's hotly debated. Like, how does that happen? How do we have an entire field where people don't know how it actually works? And I encourage you to go look at the literature.
Buddy.
People have some ideas, but they don't have the ideas out. They don't have the full understanding of what's going on. Is everybody muted out there? Yes. All right, cool. All right, so I'm finished up here. So lastly here. Okay, so let me finish this up. Be wary of treading on the domain of the gods. Okay. I'm going to wrap this all back up by going back into the psychedelics and talking about it. The reason I'm saying that is because these are dangerous materials, okay? And Terence McKenna, I believe, said it best when he said, there are old shamans, bold shamans, but no brave and old shamans, okay? These experiences, in many ways, are as real as anything else that happens in someone's life. There are numerous challenges that go on from a health aspect. There are some reasons why, there are good reasons why some people consider a Schedule I drug here in the US assignment as proper. I'm probably pretty sure it's going to go to Schedule 4 or complete decriminalization at some point here over the next decade. But there are things to be careful of. And the danger comes from a couple of things. Number one, even O'Leary talked about this, and a number of people in all kinds of studies. I'm just going to give you three things to think about. If you decide to go down that path, which I do not promote, I am not promoting it here. I'm simply telling you things to think about, okay? Number one is setting and mindset. And it seems like psychedelics are often, especially the thing LSD, which is an artificial one, and things is an amplifier, right, of particular kinds of thought processes. So if you go in depressed, there's a high possibility you're going to have a bad trip. And also, you know, if you're in an environment like where you don't feel safe, there's a very high probability that you're going to experience paranoia and other things that go on. And so setting and mindset, you have to actually go into these subjective experiences with a proper setting and mindset, know what you're getting into, okay? Number two, buddies. People always have buddies. There's a reason that the old shamans, when they worked through these things, there was a shaman, right? And the reason we have shamans is because it's a guide. Nobody should be tripping alone. And until you've developed extensive experience, the shamans all recommend against that, and there's a reason for it. And because if you have a bad trip, there's definitely an opportunity for self-harm and other issues. And so that buddy should either be completely free of any kind of intoxication, or should be someone who is at a lower level of intoxication and has a vast more experience than you. Lastly, and the most importantly, is to respect the power of these particular experiences. So one of the things that you learn, if anybody here has had weapons training, one of the first things that you have is there's a difference between someone who's grown up with guns, somebody who's a hunter and does these things with it, and somebody who just gets it as they're older. And it's because often when you're growing up with it, whoever's teaching you about weapons will teach you to respect the weapon, because it is a tool for taking life. And there's certain rules that you have, you know, about keeping it unloaded, that you never pull it out and point it at anything without expecting to kill that thing. And it is always a last resort to use that weapon, right? And so these are because you respect the power of the tool. And I could say that about any number of things that we use in our lives, about respecting the power of that tool to either cause harm or do other things. And likewise, psychedelics are similar to that. There are transcendental experiences out there that people have with these, but there are also extreme dangers to them as well. And you should be cognizant of them before you participate in any of these things. I'll give you a couple examples. Timothy Leary, when he passed away, they gave him, his wife at the time gave him a heavy shot of LSD, and he spent the last 10 minutes of his life basically going back and forth saying, why not? Why not? Which is just madness. And Terence McKenna died of brain cancer. And many people think it wasn't related to his psychedelic use, but he did pass away from brain cancer. And so there have been some studies on it, but it has not been enough studies yet. And at the same time, by respecting the power, you also respect the good things that these particular items that do. And so some people have experienced, for instance, what I mentioned about a significant change to their personality over a year. So what they found is that up to 80% of people who have these psychedelic experiences up to a year later will be much higher in what's called trait openness, which is creativity, right? Which is why there's this big burn in Silicon Valley right now. In case you didn't know, another time I'm using that, people are microdosing magic mushrooms all over the place in Silicon Valley, small dosages, because they're trying to grow their trait openness and be more creative or whatever. But I don't think they're doing it for the right reasons in that way. So anyway, that's just some things to keep in mind as you're thinking about these things and bringing up these ideas, okay? All right, so that's it for me. I'm gonna open it up for questions now. So what I'm going to do is close my sharing my screen. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of that. Let me open it up for questions. Let's see, how do I do that? I think I can unmute all. Okay, I think everybody's unmute or can unmute themselves now. This is my first big Zoom conference with a bunch of people to mute and everything. So thank you for being patient. All right, so I'm gonna open it up for questions for people. Go ahead and shout them out.
Sorry. So there was a lot of information to absorb. I was writing down names of different people. I'd like to explore a lot of these people more. I was curious about it because I had heard, listening to NPR about using this in counseling, that it opened up people in a safe environment that they could go further in traumatic incidents that occurred. So yeah, I was very curious. So thank you for adding to that and a whole lot more in AI. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, in fact, that's the main research that people are looking into is PTSD and other kinds of counseling. And it has shown remarkable effects. And that's what John Hopkins' work is really looking into right now.
Okay.
I think it's up to 80% success rates right now without falling back into it. And so we'll see if that holds up over time. Those are up for a year later, but that's way better than a lot of other options out there. So, which is why I think it'll end up going to a Schedule 4 or a Schedule 1, which allows for clinical use to treat particular kinds of things, which is where MDMA actually was in the early 80s, if I believe is correct. But I think psilocybin will definitely, it's going to get there. Some places which have a history of shamanism, like California, will definitely, they're going to decriminalize and try to open it up to the general population. We'll see how that works out for them, but you know.
Thanks.
Yeah, cool.
And are you doing a part 2 then?
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that. I hope to do a part 2, and so we'll see. I was going to do a talk at CPOSC on this, and kind of this was a dry run at it, but I only have half an hour at CPOSC. And I'm a long-winded kind of person. I'm not sure if I could fit it down into a half an hour. We'll see.
Okay. Yeah, it's a lot of good information.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions out there by folks? No? Yeah, just shoot them out.
I'll just make a comment, by the way. So I go back a ways. I'm a physicist by training. So you took me down some memory trails. You know, I've looked into Menta as well, by the way, with the HTM model.
Yes.
Really interesting work. So we could chat some time about time and space, and if you want string theory, if you want to talk about Max Teakin's theory that time is our imagination and doesn't exist. There's so much that's being explored these days. It's fascinating. But you're kind of replaying what went on for me during the 60s and 70s. It's when Timothy was really hot.
Yep.
And don't forget, Boston is a big center as well for shamanism. So my good buddy was at MIT, and he used to travel down to South America, take a few trips once in a while, guided tours, as he used to say.
Yeah, the ayahuasca trips. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a continuous loop that we're on, by the way, which is the pursuit to open the mind and let more in. Is one view of that. As you often go have an ice cream or soda or something, and again, we did a nice job on this. Getting it into a half an hour is a challenge.
Yeah,
definitely. But I think it's really on the borders of what we're trying to understand, which are models. You know, we really don't understand a lot right now in terms of the quantum world. We don't have a model.
Yeah,
you know, exactly. Is it a wave? Is it a particle? And the answer is yes. There isn't really a model. We know how it behaves. Same thing with neuroscience. We know a lot of how it behaves, but we're not sure what the models are.
Mhm.
So, and likewise, multidimensional spaces and something we get comfortable with. So I was kind of chuckling because I was at Penn when the Calabi-Yonde framework came up,
Oh,
which
nice.
has many dimensions to it. So, and we all had debates about that, whether or not, you could really explain that to mere mortals, as we so, not easy stuff. As we get better at our frameworks for, I think, explaining this, we look to folks like yourself who can really kind of coherently bring it together, and bring I think, new old metaphors. Anyway, sorry, I'm going on, but
No, it's
you
great.
obviously got my interest and whatnot. So
Great.
I'll send you a personal note. Maybe we can get together and chat some more.
Absolutely.
There's some areas you should explore, by the way. One is Feynman, if you haven't read all of Feynman's
Oh, of
stuff.
course. Yeah, Richard Feynman.
Yeah, have you done that?
Yeah, well, I mean, he's quite a wide breadth of information, so I get what I can.
Okay.
So, yeah, there's a lot.
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
going to stop the recording
I'll be
real
quiet.
quick,
Bye.
but you can hang on if you want. Hold on one second here.